Hi, it's Dr. Parikh. So this mini lecture is about initiating new relationships. And by relationships, I mean kind of broadly relationships, but probably more emphasizing friends, work relationships, things like that. An important piece of starting new relationships is just being around and available. So the first piece is proximity and the mere exposure effect. So some of the things we know in psychology about attraction and what brings people together is that people are more likely to form relationships with people who are close to them than further away from them. So, if you're living on campus, you're more likely to make friends within your residence hall than in another residence hall, and you're more likely to make friends on your floor than on another floor, and you're even more likely to make friends with the people on your side of the hallway, like in your little section of the hallway, than all the way on the other side. So the closer you are, the more likely you are to form relationships. And it's interesting, I read, there's a book, Modern Romance? I think that's what it's called, Modern Romance by Aziz Ansari, and I forget the other person, but he partnered with someone who does, I think, sociology research. And one of the stories they tell is how historically people would marry, people who had grown up very close to them. So, people from small towns would marry other people from their town or from one or two towns over. But also, even, let's say, in New York City, it might be someone from the same building or from just down the street. So the closer people are, the more likely they are to build bonds. And that's true for me on campus. Well, it's an interesting time for that conversation. So on campus, most of the people I interacted with, I would interact with other psych faculty, sometimes over email or phone, but also if I would run into them in the halls while I was teaching or at faculty meetings. But my office is in Viseglia, which is technically pronounced Visalia, but nobody pronounces it that way. So I was in Viseglia, and Dr. Sitnick was across the hall from me. So of the psych faculty, she was by far the person I was closest to, because she and I would say good morning to each other each day and talk about our weekends and our kids and our just life. And if we had a quick question or we wanted to consult about okay, here's something I'm struggling with, what do you think I should do? Typically the first thing we would do is run across the hall to each other's offices. So the closer you are, the more likely you are to interact, which means that you're more likely to form a close relationship. Similarly, outside of psych, the faculty that I have the strongest relationships with, some of them are other faculty from the hallway. So a lot of Soc and CJ people, a lot of science people, but also the people I serve on committees with or on faculty council with. So it's the people you see the most are the ones. And so that's part of that is the mere exposure effect. Just seeing someone more often tends to increase your liking for that person. So just, the more often you see them, and I think there's an episode of Seinfeld, I'm not a big Seinfeld person, but I guess there's an episode where one of the characters just, figures out this other person's schedule and just shows up repeatedly until the person develops a liking for them from this mere exposure effect. So part of it is just being out, joining groups, and being available for this to happen. Now, a funny thing is, I work real hard to find silver linings, and one of the gifts of the pandemic is that I have grown more close to my colleagues who have offices over in Werner Hall, because some of the psych faculty and I we communicate a lot more through group chats or emails or things like that. And so, whereas before I would always reach out to the person closest to me, who was almost always Dr. Sitnick, now I have a much broader network of my peers that I'm in pretty frequent contact with. So there's an interesting, and I think that's a demonstration of how the digital world really shifts this. At the same time, I think that there is still a factor of the digital world of showing up and being around. So for example, I really like board games, and not just like Monopoly and Battleship, but there's a lot of new board games that come out each year. And so I travel in a lot of online circles with hobby board games. And so you see the same people. There are some people that you only see in one or two settings in this online world, and there are other people that you see in lots and lots and lots of settings. And so it's kind of like the more you interact with a person, I would say the more strongly you feel either way about them. But in general, the more often you see someone, the more frequent. There's also, I think, a sense of like, oh, we go to a lot of the same sorts of things. We must be really similar, or at least have a lot in common, or be compatible in some way. So part of it is just being around and starting with who's around you, or who's traveling in the same circles you are. Another piece, I think, if you want to build new relationships or closer relationships, it's important to say yes to invitations and actually show up to things. I lean toward being a homebody, and so it's really tough for me to push myself to go out and do things sometimes. Almost always, at the last minute, given the choice, I would rather stay home. But I recognize that I need those relationships, and I want to go out sometimes. And so going out too much stops feeling good for me, but going out a steady amount does feel really good for me. So I understand that even though my instinct might be to say no, it's important for me to say yes and go to things often enough that I keep getting asked to do things. Because when you say no, when someone says no to you repeatedly, eventually you're like, okay, they just aren't interested in these things, and you stop inviting them. So it's important to be interacting with people. Relationships don't just happen out of nowhere. Let me just peek at, yeah. So another piece is, I think often new relationships come through established settings. So, friends of friends, or things like that. And so to grow your network, you can start with your existing network and then kind of start building from there. If you have no network, or really are stuck for how to move out, it can be really helpful to join groups that have some sort of common interests. If there's no groups existing, you can try to start one. For me personally, one of the best ways to meet people is through volunteering. Usually you're choosing, there's lots of organizations you can volunteer with, so you're choosing something that's meaningful for you, and you are having a shared experience with other volunteers. It's important that you find a group that where you're going to actually get to interact with other people through volunteering. So, for example, I have volunteered with the USO. They have a lounge at Newark Airport for service members and their families. And so I would go there, and you would, there were busy times when you were doing a lot, but for the most part, you just needed to be there for safety and cleanliness and things like that. So it's a lot of downtime. And so I would often be with another person and just kind of chit chat for 3 or 4 hours, which was very interesting. And if I had done it more frequently, I could have, you could even sort of sync up with someone where you sign up for shifts at the same times. Or it could just be a way to just kind of have interesting, unique interactions with people. And some interactions with the service members and families using the lounges too. Although often they're in the middle of traveling. It depends. Sometimes they would be very, very interested in chatting. A lot of times they're in the middle of travel. This is a break. They really just need to rest. On the other hand, at one point I had looked into volunteering with an animal shelter. And when I got there and did a shift, and I had done it in part, I really wanted to get to know people. And what I realized very quickly was that a lot of the work was solitary, and the other people who were there were largely quite a bit younger than me. It was a lot of high schoolers and college students, and not that I could not build interesting and meaningful relationships with them, but it wasn't really what I was looking for. So when you're choosing activities to do, really try to think through what is going to get you toward your goal of new relationships? What kind of people are you wanting to form relationships with? And how is this interaction going to help? Meetup groups. Meetup is a website where you can post different activities that invite people to come. So that could be a way to find things. There's also kind of existing community groups. I think religious organizations can be great for finding those sorts of opportunities. And within a religious organization, I think just showing up on a weekly or monthly or whatever basis is great. But to really get to know someone, it's helpful to dive in, whether that's volunteering, once again, or finding small groups. Many organizations have small groups based on interest, or it could be just kind of, oh, this is a group, this is the church softball league, and you could join that. Or the choir. Most organizations have some sort of choir type thing. And again, there's a lot of service opportunities there as well. You can also look sometimes for formal peer support groups. That could be a way to form new relationships. I would be clear going in what you want. You may be very happy just to have a support group. You go, you spend time together, you leave and don't interact. But sometimes there are rules around interacting outside of a group, particularly if it's a group that's facilitated by a therapist. There may be rules about that. So again, be really clear, be very intentional, seek out seek out settings that will let you build the kind of relationships that you're looking to build. So if you're looking to meet people who might be friends, and it could even be something, usually you call someone to get started, or at least there's a context that you could call. And that's a question you could ask from the beginning to say, I'm really looking to build relationships that might go beyond this group. And you can specify, I'm not looking for someone to date, but I'm looking to build friendships and supportive relationships. And how is that viewed by this group? There's also a lot of ways to have sort of shared interests, I know what this is. So you can also just start by, wearing t-shirts and having keychains and things that signal your shared interests or your kind of fandom. I think geek culture is great for this. And so it can be a way to build conversations and be a jumping off point. Part of building new relationships, this may sound kind of silly, but part of it is just being nice. People like nice people. And this doesn't mean be a doormat and let people use you and get relationships that way. I just need to check what that text is. It's fine. So things like just smiling. Research suggests that people like people who smile a lot. And that doesn't mean you have to smile constantly. I have resting sad face, and my child has inherited it. My neutral face, let me see if I can, let me just look at my phone for a minute so you can see my neutral face. My neutral face, I don't know if it got captured there, but it's just generally wah-wah. It's funny thinking about my phone. So I have no idea what phone I have, but I have an iPhone. And when I got it, it had a new capability to do like an emoji or something where, I don't know, I could build a version of myself. And I was doing it. I was like, why is the face, as you're building it, why does the face look so sad? Why wouldn't they pick like a happier or at least a more neutral face? And I was literally like done building it before I realized it was actually my face. Like it wasn't a pre-programmed, it was like the camera looking at my face and making that face on the screen. It's important to get that kind of feedback from people. And it's funny because the way I found out that I have resting sad face is there was a picture of me as a child dressed up as an angel for a nativity play. And I saw it and I'm like, oh my gosh, look at this face. I look so sad. Like I look like somebody just kicked my puppy. And my husband is like, that's kind of how you always look. So I'm like, why would someone have taken a picture when I looked like this? And he was like, well, but that's how you look. I mentioned early on about how it's important to have people who can give you that kind of difficult feedback, who care about you enough to tell you that. And I don't mean in any way that resting sad face or resting angry face or whatever your resting face is an issue that has to be solved. but it's important to be aware of it and to know, to be able to control it, to know when you would like to be intentional about having a more energetic or more pleasant, more engaged and interested looking face. So at a minimum, smiling, people like people who smile a lot. That may also be culture dependent. I've heard really interesting things. So in the US, we smile a lot at strangers, especially in the Midwest where I'm from. We don't do it as much in New Jersey, but I do it because I choose to bring that little bit of my culture and figure that eventually people will start smiling back. But in some cultures, smiling is seen as being sneaky or suspicious. Like, okay, what are you trying to pull over on me? So be aware that that may be, your mileage may vary with smiling. Complimenting others is a great way to engage and get people to like you. And again, I'm not saying use flattery to get what you want. I'm saying look for opportunities to genuinely tell people what you appreciate about them. Another thing that research suggests is that we generally underestimate how much people like us. So when you have people kind of make a guess at how other people rate them, in general, we guess too low. So I mentioned or to be intentional. Expect that relationships are going to take energy. I just need to... There is a call that is mildly important. So expect that friendships are going to take time and energy. We often think about nurturing relationships with our partners, with our kids, maybe with our family members, but we kind of assume that friendships just happen. But especially as we become adults, and especially I think after you leave college, it becomes more and more difficult to find and develop these relationships. And these are all, I don't have specific citations for these, but I had you do a lot of the readings where these came from as part of this week. They found that research has suggested that people who believed that friendships were based on luck rather than work were more lonely 5 years later. So again, there could be a lot of factors there, but it suggests that the people who believed that they needed to work and invest in relationships were less lonely later because they had better relationships. If you are, if you're happy with the number of friends you have, don't worry. And that could be having 1,000 friends, that could be having one friend or even no friends. If you're happy with where you are, of course, don't worry. But if you're at a point where you want more friends, because again, that kind of varies over time. You might have friends who move away, friends who just kind of drift apart or have a lot going on. But one way to increase your relationships is to set measurable goals. Because when you say vaguely, I'm going to start talking to more people, that's difficult to do. But if you can break it down into something that's measurable, like I'm going to have conversations with 3 people at this new event, or I'm going to follow up with 1 person after the event. So as you're at the event, it changes the way you think. Because instead of just thinking like I should talk to more people, you can specifically say like, okay, I want to talk to 3 people. Who's a good, who seems like someone I could start with? Or if you're going to follow up, as you're talking to people, you're constantly thinking like, is this a person I feel like I could follow up with after? Especially if you just feel busy or that time slips away from you, you could put on your calendar that, okay, I'm going to spend time this day and I'm going to reach out to somebody. And you could plan ahead, or you could decide in the moment, who do I want to reach out to? Things like sending birthday and holiday cards, even texts and things are a way to keep relationships up. You could also set something like a goal to travel to visit people a certain number of times a year. That's one thing I'm really bad at. It always feels like an inconvenient time to travel. And so it's really tough because now my kid's 2.5 and my brother and sister-in-law came to visit us once, but we haven't gone to visit them, or my grandma. And those 2 people used to be in somewhat of the same place, and now my brother and sister-in-law are moving to, way across the country, and it's going to be harder. So setting goals for how often to travel, and also interesting to look at things that I built a year ago, things like inviting old friends to meet over video chat. I'm sure a lot of this sounds funny being in the middle of a pandemic. But again, there are also lots of, even before the pandemic, there were a lot of online communities you could join. I think face-to-face relationships are extremely important, but virtual relationships can also be extremely meaningful and fulfilling. I mentioned you could start with friends of friends, which a source called triadic closure, so kind of closing that triangle. And often, you have some level of shared interests or traits with that person because you already have a friend in common. It's important to show interest in the other person, be open and curious, so use some of the skills from class. And I mentioned balancing online and in-person time, which again, a little difficult to do for many of us at the moment. But in general, keep in mind it's important to know that online is an option. So if you're only thinking in person and you're struggling, it may be helpful to add in online friends. But also if you are only doing online friends, it's important to think about how to also build in-person connections, whether that's finding ways to meet up with those online friends in a safe way, or figuring out how to add in-person relationships. With either type of relationship, thinking about how to make interactions meaningful. So maybe going beyond just hitting like a bunch to really making connections. If you're interacting with a new group, genuinely try to engage before you write them off as being cliquey or closed off or to new people. It could be that they are jerks and they're cliquey or they're closed for whatever reason, but you can't know that until you try. And then the last piece on this one is just being realistic about what works for you. For some people, parties and bars work great. I am not that person. I don't meet people at parties. I don't enjoy being in loud environments. I can't hear the conversation. It's not a way that I like to spend a lot of time, and it's certainly not a way that I like to build new relationships. And so think about ways of meeting people that feels comfortable for you. When you're building a new relationship, it's important to, especially if you are really eager for new relationships, it can feel like you are being a little extra in the relationship, and that can turn someone off. So it's important to dose your enthusiasm, kind of build things slowly. Don't expect it to become a ridiculously close relationship right away. And sometimes those relationships that build really quickly also unravel very quickly. So think about setting sort of a very comfortable pace where you are taking turns, sharing and disclosing, letting that depth build more naturally. Be aware of how much time you're talking and how much time you're listening, and that you're not doing, either one 90% of the time, that you're having a balance. And also notice when you feel overwhelmed by the intensity, and also sort of keep an eye on the other person for cues that it's becoming a little intense for them. And be intentional about, and again, I don't want to make you all so self-conscious that you can't talk about the things that are interesting to you, but kind of have an awareness of whether you are dominating with your interests, and make sure that you're taking time to draw out the other person. But also make sure that you are sharing something of yourself and that it's not just, a one-sided relationship. Remember that there are cultural and developmental norms. So there are some cultures and groups that are more open to new friendships, and others where it's expected that builds much more slowly. And when I was in grad school, I went to a talk, and one of the things the person talked about that stood out to me, I don't remember what their real purpose was, but they talked about the idea of refrigerator rights, of how many people's houses could you go into right now and go into their refrigerator without asking. And at the moment, for me, other than people I consider family, and even then just a few, I can't think of someone where I wouldn't at least say, oh, do you mind if I just go in your fridge? I can't think of anyone where I would just open it without saying a word. So that is becoming, that sense of closeness, of kind of being invited into each other's homes is becoming less common in US culture potentially than it used to be. I'm always a little skeptical when they say the good old days we had more of this. And particularly after the early 20s, I think that there is a drop. I remember when I was first teaching after grad school, I was adjuncting at Montclair State, and so I didn't have an office. But I had time on campus in between classes. And so I would just go into, like I was in I think it was in the student union or something, but I was in some sort of public shared space. And there was a group of students who were working on something together. I think they were like putting up a bulletin board or something. And one of the students said to another student, like, "Oh, can you dig in my purse and get out my wallet?" It was something like that. And I was just struck by like, oh, that's like, I would ask someone to bring me my purse and then I would go through my wallet. But when I was 20, I would probably have just told my friend, "Can you dig through my purse and get me my wallet?" And so that was kind of a moment where I realized it was like oh, I guess I'm kind of a stodgy old grown up now. And recognizing that I wanted more boundaries between me and most friends and people. It's also important to notice red flags, and I think I've talked about this a little in the last slide. You want to make sure not only that you are not being, that you want to make sure you're not hogging the attention, but also that this other person is not hogging the attention either. It's someone where you have a comfortable back and forth. It's also important to notice how you feel after being around the person. Sometimes when you're with someone, it feels okay. And then afterward, you're just kind of left feeling like you've been in a whirlwind or saying like, wait, that didn't seem quite right. So notice how you're responding to this person, not just in the moment, but afterward. And also, does this person bring you closer to being the kind of person you want to be? Not that this person is flawless, because that's impossible. But does their attitude bring you more in line with who you want to be? I personally find that I find that both extremes are really difficult. So either people who are so optimistic that they say everything is rainbows and unicorns and everything's great. And so if you want to complain about anything, you kind of get shut down. That feels really painful and toxic to me. But on the other hand, people who see everything as a nightmare and awful and you're a fool if you're optimistic, or you're just, too innocent, and when you get more life experience, you'll understand how awful everything is and you can't be happy about anything. That's definitely not great either. So just noticing how this person pulls you toward being. And though, I think I assigned these as part of the readings, but that's just where I got my ideas for that. That's a lot of information. I think just being creative about what works for you. I know for me, I've mentioned I enjoy board games, and I went to my first big convention last year, to PAX Unplugged, which is in Philly. And I knew that when I go to those sorts of things unstructured, I really just kind of become a wallflower and don't have a very good time. And so I was super duper intentional about it. I volunteered to work one of the booths for part of the time, because I knew that would force me to interact with people and get some of that social engagement, and to interact with the customers, but also to interact with the other people in the booth. And then I also, because I'm very active in some of the online gaming communities, I reached out in a couple of them to say, hey, is anyone else going and want to meet up for games or for dinner? And so I was able to get kind of a list of names and ended up meeting up with people for dinner, for lunch. We played a few games together, and I'm still in contact with a lot of them and have had some really neat friendships out of that. So I think it's important to think outside the box and be willing to be intentional and kind of strategic. It's easy to think that friendships are just supposed to magically happen and that, that it's all about luck. But honestly, you can do a lot to influence not just dating relationships and family, but the friendships in your life too. It's also important to remember that maintaining and deepening relationships, including friendships, takes work. And so if you just let it fade to the background, it's going to kind of fade away. One thing I noticed that I didn't talk about much was coworkers. Coworkers can be extremely important friendships. Most of my most important relationships have been coworkers or classmates. And so I think those are incredibly important places. When I was in undergrad, I honestly have very few friends who are just from my classes. And those ones usually I knew through a couple different, like they were in my classes a lot, or we also did a research, we were also in a research project class where we interacted a lot, or we had friends in common. So for me, me personally, I really need that context to build a friendship. But everyone is different. I hope this was helpful, or at least a little interesting. Thanks. Bye-bye.